Look at this photograph carefully. Do you see the damage to the engines? This Airbus A320 just scraped both of its engines along a concrete runway at over 200 knots, not because of mechanical failure, not because of bad weather, but because the pilots flying this aircraft made a series of decisions so catastrophically wrong that it defies belief. They slammed into the runway gear up, bounced a few times, and somehow managed to get airborne again. For the next 5 minutes, passengers rode in absolute terror as the damaged engines failed one by one, and the aircraft plummeted into a residential neighborhood in Karachi, Pakistan, killing 97 people.
We have lost engines. Clear, Mayday, Pakistan 8303.
This isn't a story about a single mistake or an equipment malfunction. This is a story about two pilots who ignored every warning, dismissed every procedure, lied to air traffic controllers, and flew an approach so dangerously unstabilized that it violated every fundamental principle of aviation safety. And when the investigation concluded, it revealed something even more shocking. 34% of Pakistan International Airlines pilots had fake or suspicious licenses, people who had paid others to take their exams, people who should never have been in a cockpit in the first place. Before examining exactly what went wrong on this flight, please leave a comment indicating where you follow us and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. We put a lot of effort into these investigations to provide the most accurate and detailed analysis of aviation accidents, and your support is very important to us. May 22, 2020. Pakistan International Airlines Flight 8303 was supposed to be a routine domestic flight from Lahore to Karachi. The weather was nearly perfect. Mostly clear skies with just a few scattered clouds on a bright sunny day. The kind of day where visual approaches are easy and everything should go smoothly. The captain and first officer made friendly conversation for most of the flight, chatting about topics that had nothing to do with flying the airplane. That casual atmosphere, that sense of routine and familiarity, was about to become one of the contributing factors to this disaster. The captain was 58 years old and had been flying for Pakistan International Airlines for 24 years. He had accumulated over 17,000 hours of total flight time, with nearly 4,800 hours specifically on the Airbus A320. On paper, he was an extremely experienced pilot, the kind of senior captain you'd expect to handle any situation with professionalism and skill. But his personnel file told a very different story. At one point in his career, he had undergone a psychiatric evaluation and was temporarily considered unfit to fly. He had been considered for a supervisory role with the airline, but wasn't recommended because of deficiencies in technical knowledge and general awareness. Perhaps most troubling, multiple assessments described him as bossy, overbearing, possessing below-average intelligence, and having little regard for authority. That last characteristic, little regard for authority, is going to be crucial to understanding what happens next. Because when air traffic controllers spend the next 20 minutes desperately trying to warn this captain that he's dangerously high on approach, when they offer him multiple opportunities to execute a safe go-around, when they practically beg him to abort the approach, he's going to ignore every single warning. His overconfidence, his complacency from having flown this route hundreds of times, and his refusal to accept that he's made mistakes are going to kill 97 people. The first officer was 33 years old and had accumulated almost 2,300 hours of total flight time, with over 1,500 hours on the Airbus A320. His promotion to first officer had actually been delayed because of issues during his training, but he was eventually cleared to fly. On this flight he would be the pilot flying, meaning he would physically control the aircraft, while the captain would be the pilot monitoring. This division of roles is standard in commercial aviation. Both pilots are responsible for the safety of the flight, but the captain as pilot in command has ultimate authority and responsibility. There is absolutely no excuse for a captain with 17,000 hours to allow the kind of mistakes you're about to see. As Flight 8303 began its descent toward Karachi, the first signs of trouble emerged, not dramatic warnings or system failures, just small procedural omissions that would cascade into catastrophe. The pilots were initially assigned a standard arrival procedure into Karachi, but air traffic control then cleared them direct to a waypoint called Makli. This was a shortcut that would save time and fuel, but it also meant the aircraft would have less distance to descend from cruise altitude down to the airport elevation. This shouldn't be a problem. Pilots handle shortcuts like this constantly. The standard procedure is simple: if you can't descend fast enough on the shortened route, there's a holding pattern at a waypoint called Sabin, where you can circle while descending, and then continue the approach once you're at the correct altitude. The problem is that the pilots never discussed any of this. They didn't conduct an approach briefing, a structured conversation where pilots review the approach procedure, talk about the expected descent profile, discuss threats and contingencies, and verify that the flight management system is programmed correctly. Industry best practice and airline standard operating procedures require this briefing. It's not optional, it's a critical layer of defense against exactly the kind of errors that are about to occur. The investigation revealed why they didn't do the approach briefing. They were too distracted talking about things completely unrelated to flying the airplane. There's another factor at work here. The captain had probably flown into Karachi hundreds of times over his 24-year career. He knew this arrival, this approach, this airport intimately. That familiarity breeds complacency and overconfidence, the dangerous belief that you've done something so many times that you don't need to follow the procedures anymore. You've got it all in your head. You can handle anything. Except when things start going wrong, when the situation deviates from the routine you're expecting, that overconfidence becomes deadly because you don't have the disciplined procedural framework to catch your mistakes. When air traffic control cleared Flight 8303 direct to Mackley, they also cleared the aircraft to descend to 10,000 feet. One of the pilots reached up to the flight control unit, dialed in 10,000 feet, and pushed the altitude selector knob to command a managed descent. This tells the Airbus flight management system to calculate and fly an optimal descent path down to 10,000 feet, while honoring any altitude restrictions programmed into the system. The aircraft's autopilot begins descending. Everything seems fine. Except the pilots failed to do something absolutely fundamental. They didn't cross-check and verbally verify that the aircraft was actually doing what they told it to do. This might sound like a minor detail, but it's critically important. Modern aircraft automation is extremely reliable, but pilots must always verify that the automation is performing as expected. You select a mode, you watch the flight mode enunciators change, you watch the aircraft respond, and you verbalize what you're seeing to your fellow pilot. This creates a shared mental model of what the aircraft is doing and provides a check against mode confusion or programming errors. The pilots of Flight 8303 didn't do this. They selected the descent, and then went right back to their irrelevant conversation. About 3 minutes later, air traffic control cleared them to descend further to 5,000 feet. The pilots made the change in the flight control unit. The aircraft captured the new descent profile, the autothrust reduced to idle to allow for the descent, and everything appeared normal. Once again, the pilots didn't verify any of this. They just kept talking. At some point during the descent, they even changed radio frequencies without being instructed to do so, and for about 2 minutes they weren't talking to anyone. They were essentially out of contact with air traffic control because they were so distracted by their conversation. The approach controller had to call them on the emergency guard frequency to get them back on the correct radio. As the aircraft passed through 15,000 feet, approach control cleared Flight 8303 to descend further to 3,000 feet, and cleared them for the ILS approach to runway 25 left. An ILS, Instrument Landing System, provides both lateral guidance to align with the runway centerline and vertical guidance via a glide slope to descend at the correct angle. It's one of the most common and reliable approach types. The pilots acknowledged the clearance, still no verification or discussion of what the aircraft was doing. This is the point where things start to spiral completely out of control. When the pilots received that clearance to descend to 3,000 feet, they changed the altitude on the flight control unit to 3,000, but they didn't update the flight management system. This creates a critical mismatch. The FMS still thinks the aircraft is going to fly to Sabin at 8,900 feet, enter the holding pattern, descend in the hold down to 3,000 feet, and then continue the approach. The autopilot is following the FMS programming, not the altitude selected on the control unit, because they're in managed descent mode. The aircraft is planning to level off at 8,900 feet at Sabin. The pilots had multiple opportunities to catch this error. Their navigation displays showed a white curved arrow at Sabin indicating the holding pattern direction. As they got closer, the display would show the complete holding pattern. They could have looked at the FMS control display unit and seen the programmed hold, the descent in holding, and the exit from holding. Most importantly, if they had been verifying what the aircraft was doing instead of chatting about irrelevant topics, they could have caught the error immediately and updated the FMS. Simulator testing after the accident proved that if they had simply modified the FMS to show 3,000 feet at Mackley, the aircraft would have automatically adjusted its descent profile and they would have reached the approach intercept at the correct altitude. Everything would have been fine. Instead, what happens next is absolute chaos. The aircraft is at 9,300 feet when it reaches Mackley. This is actually still manageable because the FMS has that holding pattern programmed at the next waypoint, Sabin. The aircraft is planning to enter the hold and continue descending. That's why when the approach controller asks, "Confirm track miles comfortable for descent," one of the pilots responds, "FM." The controller is essentially asking, are you going to hold to descend or are you continuing with the approach? At this moment, if the pilots had simply said, "We'll take one turn in holding," and let the aircraft fly its programmed profile, everything would have been fine. But the captain suddenly realizes they're high. Instead of calmly analyzing the situation and making a rational decision, either hold to descend or execute a go-around and try again, he goes into complete panic mode. He starts yelling at the first officer, "What has happened? Stop, stop, oh no. Take out the hold, take out the hold." The first officer, who is supposed to be flying the aircraft, now has to comply with the captain's panicked commands. He starts reprogramming the FMS to remove the holding pattern while simultaneously trying to fly the airplane. The first officer asks if they should report the problem to approach control, but the captain tells him no, just tell them you're established on the localizer. He's instructing the first officer to lie about their situation. Think about what's happening in that cockpit right now. The first officer is the pilot flying, which means his primary job is to fly the aircraft, aviate, navigate, communicate, in that order. Instead, the captain has him talking on the radios and making changes to the FMS while they're below 10,000 feet on an approach, which is completely contrary to standard operating procedures. Normally, the pilot monitoring makes FMS changes because you don't want the pilot flying to be heads down in the cockpit during critical phases of flight. The captain should be making the radio calls, but instead he's barking orders and creating chaos. At this point, they're at 9,200 feet. If they were flying the approach correctly without holding, they should be at 4,700 feet. They're literally twice as high as they should be. To try to fix this, the captain extends the speed brakes devices that disrupt airflow over the wings to increase drag and steepen the descent. Then he reaches up and pulls the altitude selector knob, which changes the autopilot mode from managed descent to open descent. This commands idle thrust and creates a steeper rate of descent, but critically, it also causes the autopilot to disregard altitude restrictions on the approach. Open descent mode is specifically not recommended during final approach for exactly this reason. You lose altitude protection. While all of this is happening, the Karachi control tower can see flight 8303 on radar, and they can see the aircraft is dangerously high. Tower calls approach control and says the aircraft is too high. Approach responds, "Yes, it's too high, I am observing," and we gave orbit, meaning they had cleared the aircraft to hold if needed. The approach controller asks the pilots what altitude they're passing, and one of them responds by rounding down several hundred feet. They're lying about how high they are. They pass over Sabin at 7,800 feet when they should be at 3,000 feet. They're now 4,800 feet too high and only a few miles from the runway. This is the moment where one of these pilots, either one of them, just needs to say the words "go around." That's it. 2 words. Level off, tell approach you're executing a missed approach, climb to a safe altitude, slow down, configure the aircraft properly, and set up for another attempt. It would have been completely safe. It would have been the correct decision. It's shocking that the first officer just continues to go along with whatever the captain is doing. Yes, there are cultural factors in some airlines where first officers are reluctant to challenge captains, but at some point you have to value your own life and the lives of 99 people in the back of the airplane more than your concern about offending the captain. The controllers are trying desperately to help. When the aircraft is 10 miles from the runway, the controller says, 75 for 3,000, the present position is 10 miles from touchdown. This is a polite but urgent way of saying you're 4,500 feet too high and only 10 miles from the runway. What are you going to do? The captain's response: No problem, sir. No problem. They're traveling at over 200 knots, descending at an insane rate, miles above where they should be, and the captain, with below average intelligence and little regard for authority, tells the controller there's no problem. A few seconds later, someone changes the target airspeed to 248 knots, and the landing gear is lowered. Neither pilot calls for the gear. Whoever lowers it doesn't announce it. This is a massive breach of standard operating procedures. Callouts and verbalizations exist specifically to ensure both pilots have a shared understanding of what's happening. With the landing gear and speed brakes extended, their rate of descent increases to 7,500 feet per minute, an insane descent rate when you're close to the ground. For reference, a normal approach descent rate is around 700-800 feet per minute. The controller tries again. Sir, orbit is available if you want. He's giving them another chance to level off and hold. The captain directs the first officer to tell them it's okay, and after hesitating, the first officer says, "Negative, we are comfortable. We can make it, inshallah, God willing." To me, that hesitation and that phrase, "God willing," suggests the first officer knows they're not going to make it, but he still doesn't assert himself or refuse to continue this suicidal approach. About 30 seconds later, the captain says something absolutely chilling to the first officer. He will be surprised what we have done. This demonstrates the captain's insane overconfidence and complete detachment from reality. He actually seems proud of what they're doing, like they're pulling off some impressive feat of airmanship, when in reality they're conducting one of the most dangerously unstabilized approaches in commercial aviation history. The controller tries a fourth time when they're about 7 miles from the runway. Disregard, turn left heading 180. The terminology should technically have been something like cancel approach clearance, fly heading 180, maintain 3,000 feet, but the intent is absolutely clear: abort this approach immediately. The pilots ignore him. A few seconds later they report, "We are comfortable now out of 5,500 for 3,000 established," once again lying about their altitude. Remember, this is a clear sunny day. The pilots can look outside and visually see the runway. They should be able to assess just by looking that their approach angle is dangerously steep, that they're coming in way too fast, that nothing about this approach is normal or safe. But they continue anyway, driven by the captain's refusal to admit he's made a mistake, and the first officer's inability or unwillingness to challenge him. There's another critical problem developing that neither pilot realizes. This entire time, they've had the aircraft configured to fly an ILS approach. They've intercepted the localizer, the lateral guidance signal that keeps them aligned with the runway centerline. The other component of an ILS is the glide slope, which provides vertical guidance at typically a 3-degree descent angle to the runway. But when you try to intercept a glide slope from above, which is exactly what Flight 8303 is doing, you run a serious risk of intercepting what's called a false glide slope. False glide slopes are spurious signals that exist above the true glide slope. To the aircraft systems and to the cockpit instruments, a false glide slope looks identical to the real thing. But following it results in a much steeper descent angle, sometimes 9 degrees or more instead of the normal 3 degrees. This is precisely why procedures require aircraft to be at or below the glide slope intercept altitude, and to capture the glide slope from below. The pilots of Flight 8303, in their panicked attempts to salvage this disaster, have set themselves up to follow a false glide slope, making an already catastrophic situation even worse. The controllers recognize what's happening. They tell the pilots, "That's negative, turn left heading 180, another attempt to get them to abandon the approach. But even though they're still massively above the correct flight path, the pilots respond, "We are established on ILS 25 left, they're not established." They're following a false glide slope while descending at a rate that would be dangerous even in an emergency. Pay close attention to what happens next, because the situation is about to deteriorate beyond anything you might imagine. The aircraft is still following that false glide slope and the pitch attitude is getting steeper and steeper. As their nose-down pitch exceeds 13 degrees, for context, a normal approach is around 3 degrees nose-down, their descent rate hits 6,800 feet per minute, and suddenly the autopilot disconnects. They get a master warning. The autopilot has determined the aircraft is outside its operational envelope and has given up. At this point, a human pilot needs to hand-fly the aircraft. The shocking thing is that neither pilot acknowledges the autopilot disconnect or the warning. There's no call-out, no discussion about who's flying the aircraft now, no recognition that they've just transitioned from automated flight to manual control during one of the most critical and dangerous phases of flight. They just continue barreling toward the runway. Things get worse as they start getting sink rate cautions, automated warnings that their descent rate is excessive. Then they get pull-up warnings from the ground proximity warning system. A pull-up warning is not a suggestion. It's not something you discuss or analyze. It requires an immediate terrain avoidance maneuver. Full thrust, pitch up, climb away from the ground. It's a memory item that every pilot is trained to respond to instantly and instinctively. Instead of executing the pull-up maneuver, one of the pilot's investigations suggests it was the first officer raises the landing gear and retracts the speed brakes. He doesn't say anything about doing this. He doesn't announce his actions. The other pilot apparently doesn't notice. They're now screaming toward the runway at over 200 knots with no landing gear extended. Just 3 miles from the runway, one of the pilots extends the flaps to flaps 3, triggering more overspeed warnings. The aircraft is shaking, alarms are blaring, warnings are cascading, and still neither pilot says the words "go around." Finally, at 1,100 feet and 227 knots, roughly 260 miles per hour, the first officer asks if they should do the orbit. The captain responds, No, leave it." The investigation determined that the first officer was probably the one who had raised the landing gear and retracted the speed brakes because he wanted to abandon the approach. But he never actually voiced his concern clearly to the captain. He never said, "We need to go around." He never said, "I've raised the gear." He just silently made control inputs, hoping the captain would get the hint, and the captain either didn't notice or didn't care. At this point, the captain takes over the flight controls. Instead of following procedure and clearly announcing "I have the aircraft," he just pushes his control stick forward. Both control sticks are now receiving simultaneous inputs. The first officer is still holding his stick, and now the captain is pushing his. They get a dual input warning, meaning both pilots are trying to fly the plane at the same time. In an Airbus, the control sticks don't move together. If both pilots make inputs, the aircraft averages them. It's a design that can work well when both pilots are coordinated, but when they're not communicating and are making opposite inputs, it's a disaster. Not surprisingly, neither pilot says anything about the dual input warning or discusses who's actually flying the aircraft. As they descend through 1,000 feet above ground level, let me show you just how far outside normal parameters they are. For a stabilized approach, which is an absolute requirement in commercial aviation, the aircraft should be on the correct approach path, at the correct speed, in the correct configuration, with the landing gear down, at an appropriate descent rate. Flight 8303 at 1,000 feet, airspeed 230 knots, when it should be around 140, descent rate 2,000 feet per minute, when it should be around 700, configuration flaps 3 when it should be full flaps, and critically landing gear retracted, when it should be down and locked. Every single parameter is wrong. This should trigger an immediate go-around. Instead they continue. The aircraft, being smarter than the pilots, starts screaming at them. They get a too low gear warning, an automated alert that they're approaching the ground with the landing gear retracted. More overspeed warnings. The pilots ignore all of them. At 500 feet above the ground, they're still traveling at 220 knots, about 253 miles per hour, and descending at 2,000 feet per minute. Now they're in ground effect, just a few feet above the runway, traveling at a speed 90 knots faster than normal landing speed, with no landing gear. Here's where it gets even more insane. While they're still airborne, just feet above the concrete, someone investigation couldn't determine which pilot selected full reverse thrust on both engines. Reverse thrust is only effective when the aircraft is on the ground with weight on the wheels. Trying to engage it while airborne does nothing because the reverser doors won't fully deploy until ground sensors are activated. They're trying to use a system that won't work for a landing they're not configured to make, at a speed that's dangerous even in normal circumstances. The aircraft slams into runway 25 left. Not the landing gear, because the landing gear is retracted. The engines, two massive CFM56 turbofan engines in pods mounted under the wings, make contact with the concrete at over 220 knots. The sound must have been horrific, metal grinding on concrete, sparks flying, the shriek of turbine blades disintegrating. At the moment of impact, the captain has full nose-down input on his control stick, while the first officer is pulling his control stick almost full nose up. They're literally fighting each other for control, while the aircraft is grinding down the runway on its engines. They get an engine fire warning for the number 2 engine as they bounce and skid. The friction, the damage to the engine casings, the fuel lines rupturing, the right engine is on fire. The aircraft bounces back into the air from the impact, touches down again, skids further, bounces again. For the passengers in the cabin, this must have been absolutely terrifying. Violent impacts, the horrible grinding sound, alarms blaring, not knowing what was happening, or if they were about to die. Finally, the first officer yells, "Take off, sir. Take off." Actually, at this point, the better choice would have been to stay on the ground. They're already on the runway, they could deploy the speed brakes, extend the landing gear to help slow down, use manual braking, and try to stop before running out of runway. The damage is done, the engines are destroyed, but the aircraft structure might still be somewhat intact. Trying to take off on two badly damaged engines is incredibly dangerous. That's probably what the captain was trying to do initially, stay on the ground and stop. But for some reason, at this moment, the captain finally decides to listen to the first officer. He advances both thrust levers to the takeoff and go around power setting. Somehow, despite the catastrophic damage, the engines respond. The aircraft accelerates and staggers back into the air. They're airborne again, but now they're flying an Airbus A320 with two engines that have been ground along a concrete runway at 220 knots. The structural damage, the fuel system damage, the fire warnings, this aircraft is dying, and they've just committed to flying it. There's no discussion between the pilots about what just happened. No debrief about the gear-up landing. No analysis of aircraft system status. No plan for what to do next. The captain apparently decides to circle around and attempt another landing on the same runway. They begin a left turn to position for another approach to runway 25 left. In the cabin, passengers who survived the crash later described these moments, not knowing if they were going to make it, praying, some crying, some silent in shock. Then the number one engine, the left engine, does what badly damaged engines inevitably do. It fails. Not just a loss of power, but an uncommanded in-flight shutdown. The engine simply stops, and now they're flying on one engine. Except they're not, because when the number 2 engine fire warning illuminated earlier, the pilots had pulled that thrust lever to idle per the fire warning checklist, so now both engines are at idle or failed. They have essentially no thrust. The aircraft is a 150,000 pound glider with terrible gliding characteristics. They maintain this situation for about 1 minute before one of them realizes what's happened. Someone advances the number 2 thrust lever, the right engine that had been on fire. Amazingly, due to the damage, the engine can only produce about 65% of rated thrust. They have one failed engine, and one badly damaged engine producing partial power, and they're trying to fly a traffic pattern to land. It's not going to work. As they begin a base turn toward the runway, a turn that will align them with the runway for landing, the aircraft is slow, and has insufficient power. They start getting stall warnings. The aircraft is approaching aerodynamic stall, where the wings can no longer generate enough lift to sustain flight. They're losing altitude. Instead of recognizing they need to reduce the turn angle, lower the nose, and try to maintain flying speed even if it means landing in an undesired area. One of the pilots lowers the landing gear. This creates additional drag at exactly the moment they can least afford it. The stall warnings continue. The aircraft is sinking. They're turning toward the runway, but losing altitude rapidly. They're not going to make it. Flight 8303, with 99 people on board, crashes into a densely populated residential neighborhood in Model Colony, a suburb of Karachi. The impact destroys several houses. The aircraft explodes and burns. The devastation is total. Somehow, and this is almost miraculous given the circumstances, 2 passengers survive. 2 people out of 99 on board walk away from a crash that destroyed the aircraft and killed everyone else. One survivor was seated near an emergency exit, and was thrown clear during the impact. Another landed in the wreckage, but survived the fire. 97 people died, 91 passengers and all 8 crew members, including both pilots. The survivors who lived received 250,000 Pakistani rupees in compensation, approximately $3,125 US dollars. The families of the victims received 500,000 rupees, about $6,250. These tiny compensation amounts reflect Pakistan's economic situation, but they're almost insulting given the magnitude of what happened and the preventable nature of this disaster. The investigation that followed was extensive and disturbing. Investigators analyzed the captain's flight history for the 12 months prior to the crash. He had flown 289 flights during that period. The analysis revealed a pattern of unstabilized approaches across numerous flights, high speeds, excessive descent rates, ground proximity warning system alerts, all without any go-arounds. The captain had apparently made a habit of flying dangerous approaches and getting away with it. Until he didn't. The first officer's training records showed he had struggled during initial training and his promotion had been delayed, but eventually he was certified and allowed to fly. The investigation questioned whether the training and checking processes at Pakistan International Airlines were adequate to identify pilots who weren't fully competent or who had difficulty following procedures. Then came the revelation that shocked the aviation world. 1 month after the crash of Flight 8303, the investigation revealed something that seemed almost unbelievable. 34% of Pakistan International Airlines pilots, more than 1 in 3, had fake or suspicious pilot licenses. These weren't minor discrepancies in paperwork. These were pilots who had paid other people to take their written exams, pilots who had falsified their flight time, pilots who didn't actually have the qualifications they claimed to have. Some had literally bought their licenses without ever properly demonstrating proficiency. Think about what that means. When you board a Pakistan International Airlines flight, there was a 1 in 3 chance your pilot didn't legitimately earn their license. They might not actually know how to fly the aircraft they're commanding. They might not understand the systems, the procedures, the emergency protocols. This wasn't just a problem with Flight 8303, this was a systemic corruption that permeated the entire airline. The Pakistani government responded by grounding dozens of pilots and launching investigations. Pakistan International Airlines' international reputation was destroyed. Many countries banned or restricted PIA flights. The airline, already struggling financially, faced an existential crisis, but for the families of the 97 people who died on Flight 8303, none of this brought their loved ones back. Perhaps the most tragic finding from the investigation is this: if the pilots had simply left the landing gear down when they scraped the runway, it's possible, even likely, that they could have stopped on the runway. The landing gear would have taken the impact loads, the brakes and reversers could have been used to decelerate, and the aircraft probably would have been destroyed, but everyone might have lived. The decision to raise the gear after the initial impact, and then to attempt to take off on damaged engines, is what sealed their fate. Let's talk about the lessons from this disaster, because they're important for understanding not just what happened to Flight 8303, but how accidents happen in general. First, complacency kills. The captain had flown this route hundreds of times, he knew Karachi, he was comfortable. That comfort made him sloppy. He didn't do the approach briefing. He didn't verify what the aircraft was doing. When things went wrong, his complacency prevented him from recognizing the severity of the situation. If you fly, whether you're a commercial pilot or a general aviation pilot, never let familiarity breed complacency. Follow procedures every single time. Second, overconfidence is deadly. The captain's response to controllers warning him he was dangerously high, "No problem, sir," demonstrates a disconnect from reality. His comment to the first officer, "He will be surprised what we have done," shows he actually thought he was demonstrating exceptional skill. In reality, he was conducting a suicidal approach. Confidence in aviation is good, but it must be tempered with humility and a recognition that the laws of physics don't care about your ego. Third, crew resource management matters. The first officer knew something was wrong. His hesitation, his eventual question about whether they should orbit, his phrase "God willing," all of these suggest he understood the danger, but he never clearly asserted himself. He never said, "We need to go around." This is partly cultural in some societies. Challenging authority is extremely difficult, but it's also a training and organizational issue. Airlines and flight training organizations must create cultures where speaking up is not just allowed but expected and required. Fourth, procedures exist for a reason. The approach briefing, the stabilized approach criteria, the go-around decision points, these aren't bureaucratic checklists. They're safety barriers developed from decades of accidents and incidents. Every time you skip a procedure because you think you don't need it, you're removing a layer of protection. The pilots of Flight 8303 skipped multiple procedures, and each omission made the next mistake more likely. Fifth, when things go wrong, don't compound errors trying to save a bad situation. When the pilots realized they were high, the correct response was a go-around, level off, tell ATC, climb away, try again. Instead, they tried to salvage an unsalvageable approach, making increasingly desperate decisions that made everything worse. When you're in trouble in an aircraft, sometimes the best decision is to give up on your current plan and reset. Don't let pride or time pressure drive you into making a bad situation catastrophic. Finally, regulatory oversight matters. The fake license scandal at Pakistan International Airlines didn't happen overnight. It was years of inadequate oversight, corruption and systemic failures. When regulatory agencies don't have the resources, authority, or will to properly oversee airlines and enforce standards, the result is predictable. Governments and aviation authorities must take their responsibilities seriously, because when they don't, people die. For the passengers on Flight 8303, they did everything right. They bought tickets on what should have been a safe airline. They boarded a modern aircraft. They trusted that the pilots in the cockpit were qualified and competent. They trusted that the regulatory system worked. They were let down at every level by pilots who ignored procedures, by an airline that hired unqualified people, by a regulatory system that failed to catch the fraud. This accident was entirely preventable if the pilots had done an approach briefing, if they had updated the FMS, if they had listened to the controllers, if they had executed a go-around when they were high, if they had landed with the gear down, if they had stayed on the runway after the gear-up landing, if the airline had better training and checking, if the regulators had caught the fake licenses. Any one of these interventions could have prevented 97 deaths. The damaged engines you saw in that opening photograph tell only part of the story. Behind that damage is a chain of decisions, errors, and systemic failures that turned a routine domestic flight into one of Pakistan's deadliest aviation disasters. The pilots of Flight 8303 made insane mistakes. There's no other way to describe them, but those mistakes were enabled by an organization and a system that had already failed long before the aircraft ever took off from Lahore. If you found this investigation valuable, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future analysis. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this accident and what lessons you think are most important. Aviation safety improves when we study accidents honestly and learn from them. The 97 people who died on Flight 8303 deserve for their deaths to mean something, to drive changes that prevent future accidents. That only happens when we're willing to look at disasters like this, understand what went wrong, and commit to doing better. The story of Pakistan International Airlines Flight 8303 is ultimately about the consequences of complacency, overconfidence, and systemic corruption. It's a reminder that aviation safety isn't just about technology or training, it's about culture, oversight, procedures, and the willingness of individuals to speak up when something isn't right. Every time you fly, dozens of safety systems and procedures are working to protect you. But those systems only work if the humans in the cockpit and throughout the organization do their jobs with professionalism, integrity, and respect for the enormous responsibility they carry. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to subscribe so we can reach 1,000 subscribers.